back. I'm John Davenport, and this is Phogropathy. Today, we're going to be talking about blend modes in Photoshop. So much fun. So, if you're just diving into Photoshop, one of the first things you'll probably realize is that there are a ton of blend modes when you open up this panel. In fact, there are 27 different blend modes. And that can be kind of overwhelming, especially when you start applying those blend modes to a layer and you start getting all sorts of weird things, right? So it kind of makes sense that blend modes are something that we would start with. Since I'm starting this kind of tutorial series as I learn Photoshop, blend modes is one of the first things that I had questions about, so I went and found answers, and now I'm sharing them with you. Now, we're not going to talk about all 27 of the blend modes today. We're just going to talk about some of the most commonly used ones and how they work, and then how the whole blend mode area is kind of set up so that it's kind of logical and makes sense. But we're not going to dive into too much detail here. This is just kind of a very brief overview of what blend modes are, how they work, and how to apply them to an image. So, as you briefly saw before, we have this image here of my nice model here, Alicia, and we're going to be working on using two different textures here to show this. We have this texture, and then we have a kind of a more paper kind of texture, and we'll kind of work on both of them just to see how they differ. But you don't want to, when you're applying a texture, you might first think, oh, well, I'll just reduce the opacity, and that'll kind of give the texture effect over the top of your image. But that's not really what you want to do when you want to apply a texture, and there's a lot more power to blend modes than just applying a texture, so it's good to know what the blend modes do when you're actually working with them. Opacity is a great tool because you can change the intensity of your blend. So if you get something in, say, an overlay blend mode, but you don't want it to be quite as intense as it is, you can then just reduce the opacity of that blend mode, and that will tone down the effect of that. But first, let's just talk about the four major blend modes that kind of are most commonly used. And those are multiply, screen, overlay, and soft light. And then, of course, your normal blend mode, which is just no blend mode really applied. So Adobe actually did something pretty smart when they laid out the blend modes in this panel here. You have Darken at the top of this section. So everything here under Darken up until this first break kind of works to darken the image. It works on the darker end of the pixels. So if I click on, for example, Darken, what ends up happening is everything in my selected layer, so right now it's my texture, everything in that layer that is darker than the layer below it, which, because my other texture is hidden, the layer below my texture is my layer 0, which is my photograph here of Alicia. You can see everything that's darker in that photograph shows through, and everything else, the texture remains the same. So that's kind of what Darken does. It takes the dark pixels from the layer below and brings them forward, and then everything else on the texture remains. Or you could think of it another way. Any pixel on the texture that is lighter than the pixels on the layer below that texture will become transparent. Now, with Adobe and Photoshop, many things, if you do one thing one way, there's something to do the opposite. So lighten works in the opposite effect. So as you can see here, everything that is now lighter on the image below shows through. So all the dark pixels from that texture become transparent. So those are kind of, they're not really commonly used because they don't really blend anything together. They just get rid of certain pixels based on the layer below the image that you're applying the overlay or the blend mode to. But it's good to know that what these do, because each of these will give you a key to what the the blend modes below those things will work with. So as I said, multiply is one of the more common blend modes. And what multiply does is it works by essentially multiplying the luminosity of the pixels in both the texture and the underlying layer, or your selected layer in the underlying layer. So you get a blend of both of those, and the result of that multiplication is a darker overall image with your texture kind of blended into it. So as you can see here, the image got quite a bit darker than it was originally. Here's the original image again. With that blend mode applied, we get quite a bit darker, but we also get that texture effect applied to it. Now, if you don't want it quite as strong, as I mentioned, you can reduce the effect by playing around with your opacity slider. You can also add certain curves adjustments to that, but that's getting beyond what I know right now, so we'll just stick with the basics here. So again, for everything in Photoshop, there's an opposite, and that's kind of what screen does. So when I go to screen, we get kind of a lighter image. And again, it works on the same principle of using the layer that you're working on, your active layer, and the layer below it, and blending those two things together to give you the end result. Now, the other two that are commonly used are overlay and soft light. So overlay, very kind of basic. It's probably the one that makes the most sense to people when they think about it. You're kind of overlaying the image, but what you don't really know is what it's doing exactly. So essentially, the overlay blend mode works by applying the multiply blend mode and the screen blend mode to different parts of the image. So it applies your multiply blend mode to the darker parts, so the darks get darker, and it applies the screen blend mode to the lighter pixels, so your lights get lighter. And if you remember anything from any of my Lightroom videos, when you get your darks darker and your lights lighter, you add contrast. And that's exactly what's happened to this image here. If you take a look at the original, and then with the texture and overlay blend mode applied, you get a much higher contrast in your photograph, and you're also, because this is a textured layer, pulling that texture into the image. Again, you can reduce that effect by playing with your opacity slider and get something that's maybe not so intense. But another way to get something that's a little less intense than overlay is using your screen mode and soft light blend mode. And as you can see here, the soft light blend mode does something not quite as intense as overlay, but it's still something. You can see there's still a bit of that brown color from this texture layer being brought into the image, but it's not applying it as strictly as the overlay blend mode. Once again, here's the overlay blend mode. So you can see there is quite a difference between the two, but they work on the same principle of working with the shadows and the light pixels in your image by using a combination of the multiply and the screen blend modes. So that's just a very brief overview of blend modes in Photoshop. Those are the four that, from what I've researched so far in various YouTube videos and online and articles, those are the four most commonly used blend modes. Some of these other ones will give you much different effects, and we'll go into them as I learn more about how to use them for a photograph. But the big thing is to just kind of get used to at least these four, because they're kind of the ones that seem to be very commonly used for things like darkening an image or lightening an image or adding contrast to an image. You can do that. You can kind of do two things at once here. You can add a texture and contrast, or you can add a texture and darken, or a texture and lighten, and you can get various things out of it. And just to show you, if we bring up this other texture here, we can do the same thing, darken, and again you get that same idea where anything darker in the texture is kept, anything lighter in the texture is gone and becomes transparent. And you just get different effects here. So here, because this texture is more saturated, you're getting a more saturated high contrast end result. So remember to choose your textures wisely and everything. So that's just kind of a very brief overview of blend modes in Photoshop. I'll have more for you next week as we dive into something else. If you have a question about Photoshop, leave a comment below because I'm learning too here. Remember, I'm learning Photoshop as you learn Photoshop. So if you have a question, leave it in the comments below. I'll find an answer, I'll make a video, and I'll get it back to you. So thank you for watching. Remember, please subscribe, and if you found this at all helpful, share on various social networks. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.